The loudest voice in the room isn't the one wearing the crown. True power belongs to those who know when to speak and when to stay silent, shaping the fate of a kingdom. Beyond the grandeur of royal ceremonies and flashing cameras, one woman has quietly made history without needing applause. Princess Anne. She is the steady force of the monarchy, always a few steps behind the throne, but fully aware of where it was headed. While the world speculated endlessly about King Charles's health and the question of succession, Anne already held the answer. She had anticipated the moment for weeks, perhaps months, before anyone else dared to say it aloud. But she wasn't just waiting. She was preparing. And now, for the first time, she breaks the silence. Not with an official announcement or a grand speech, but with a date carefully marked in her personal journal. A date destined to change British history. The upcoming coronation of Prince William and Catherine is far more than a ceremony. It marks a passage, a handing over of the torch that Anne quietly helped ignite, not because she sought to lead, but because leadership found her in her quiet strength. She didn't crave the spotlight, but she shaped the defining moments of this new reign. With a simple nod and a velvet box set on a silent table, Anne has set the wheels in motion. This isn't just her story. It's the story of a monarchy reinventing itself, led by the one royal who never needed to be king to secure the crown's future. The architect has spoken. The coronation's path began not in Westminster, but in the calm determination of Anne. There were no trumpets, no guards parading the courtyard, no aides rushing with briefing papers. In a small, sunny room at Clarence House sat 3 chairs, one for Charles, one for Anne, and one for William, who had yet to take his seat. Anne arrived early, summoned not by official order but by a personal telegram from Charles, written in his own careful handwriting. "We should talk. Just us." That was enough. Not for drama, but for finality. In a world ruled by protocols and ceremonies, just us meant something permanent. When she entered, Charles sat quietly, shoulders slightly hunched, fingers loosely folded in his lap. The man who once lived in his mother's shadow now appeared weary, a faded figure weighed down by duty, yet his eyes were clear. "Don't be afraid. This isn't confusion," he said quietly, with quiet certainty. William stood by the window, posture steady but unreadable. He didn't turn to Anne as she entered, his gaze fixed on the garden where he had played as a child. Charles never said the word abdicate. He didn't have to. Anne had spent her life understanding the meaning behind the silences of her family. The pause before Charles spoke was long. His voice barely wavered, not out of doubt, but relief. "The crown must go where it can endure," he said simply, looking at William but placing the burden of his words on Anne. There was no mention of illness or pressure, no blame on fatigue or public opinion. He spoke as though finally freeing himself from a role he had chased for decades, only to find peace in letting it go. Anne remained silent at first, studying her brother, the man she had often argued with, defended, and even been frustrated by. Then, she noticed something she hadn't seen in years. Not weakness, but a sense of completion. He had done what he came to do, and now he was ready to step aside. William still hadn't spoken, but his silence wasn't confusion. It was respect. More than anyone else, he understood that this wasn't just a matter of passing a title. It was a profound shift, in time, in tone, in the very rhythm of the monarchy itself. When William finally gave a nod, it wasn't just acceptance. It was readiness, a quiet understanding passed down through generations. Anne watched it all with the steady calm of someone who carried burdens heavier than crowns. She saw the baton being passed, not with ceremony, but with quiet soulfulness. No cameras, no applause, just a father releasing his grip. A son stepped forward, and a sister, ever the steadfast presence, bore witness to the subtle tremor beneath the royal walls. That night, Anne couldn't sleep. She sat at her desk, her pen hovering over the page longer than usual. When the words finally came, they were slow and deliberate, carved with the weight of time. It had begun, not with legacy, but with love. The next day, no headlines broke. No early morning leaks stirred the air. The palace gates opened as usual, and the world went on as if nothing had changed. But Anne knew better. Something old had shifted, something sacred, quietly, without fanfare. History had been whispered, and she had heard every word. Anne had always understood that the true burden of the crown wasn't in its gold or jewels, but in the unseen decisions made behind closed doors. The morning after that quiet meeting, Anne didn't return to her usual routine. She didn't call aides or arrange press briefings. Instead, she locked her door, drew the curtains, and opened her leather-bound journal, a book holding more truth than any official statement ever could. Her entry began in her precise handwriting. "He's letting go." She stared at those 3 words for several moments, her pen lingering at the edge of the page. Charles's words from the day before echoed in her mind, not shaky or full of regret, but steady and resolved. He wasn't breaking under pressure. He was making peace with it. Anne knew clarity came at a price. To surrender the crown meant giving up a lifetime's worth of duty. Every speech, every ribbon cutting, every royal wave had led to this moment. But stepping away didn't mean abandoning purpose. Someone had to carry the burden forward, and it was Anne's responsibility once again to guide that transition, carefully, so as not to disturb the delicate balance. She spent hours in her study, surrounded by calendars, ancestral portraits, and binders filled with royal anniversaries. The date had to mean something, not just to the country, but to the very heart of the monarchy. Coronations weren't just celebrations. They were statements etched in history. Anne needed to make sure this one spoke the right message. She flipped through tentative dates scribbled along the edges of her papers. One was their mother's first televised Christmas message. Another fell on the day Queen Elizabeth set sail on the Britannia for her inaugural Commonwealth tour. Yet none of these felt quite right. They were grand, yes, but too formal, too staged. Then a small, almost forgotten moment came to mind. A day hardly anyone remembered because it hadn't made headlines. The day Catherine, newly titled Duchess of Cambridge, visited a children's hospice all on her own. It was her first solo public appearance, a true test under the unforgiving glare of the media. Anne had watched from afar, both intrigued and cautious. But what Catherine did that day stayed with her. She spoke sincerely, without notes. She didn't pose for photos or rush off once the cameras stopped clicking. She stayed until every child, nurse, and grieving mother had been seen. That was the moment Anne recognized something quietly regal in Catherine's spirit, long before any crown would ever rest on her head. Anne marked that date with a red pen and circled it twice. This wasn't just about William becoming king. It was about how the public needed to feel, not dazzled or entertained, but comforted and authentic. The monarchy could no longer be about spectacle. It had to be a source of steady reassurance. Closing her notebook, Anne placed her hand over the cover. The weight of it all remained heavy, but the plan was taking shape. She hadn't shared it with anyone, not Charles, not William. Some truths, she believed, needed time to settle in the heart before being spoken aloud. This solitary, remarkable day was hers to keep until the world was ready to hear it. A date had been chosen. Not announced or proclaimed, but selected with the quiet resolve only Anne could summon. Long before the world began calling Catherine Queen, Anne had already made her decision. She didn't need palace advisors' approval or public opinion polls. She didn't even need Charles to silently confirm their shared understanding. Catherine, Duchess, mother, consort, had been carrying the weight of the crown long before it ever touched her head. It wasn't in her posture, her attire, or the way the cameras treated her with calculated respect. It was in her quiet moments. She was present in rooms no one recorded. She offered comfort when it was needed, not because it was expected. Anne had quietly observed this growth over the years. In those humble acts, she saw something that couldn't be taught, only revealed. It began with that hospice visit, but it wasn't a single moment. Catherine had played dozens, maybe hundreds of roles no one had documented. After royal visits, the Queen herself would write personal thank-you notes to hosts. Catherine would quietly donate from her own funds after charity events. She'd send flowers from her garden to families in mourning, not from the palace. These weren't stories for the press. They were stories Anne learned from those who lived them. Organizers, nurses, teachers. They spoke of Catherine not as a duchess, but as someone who truly saw them, who stayed longer than expected, remembered names months later, and followed up even when the cameras had gone. Anne understood exactly what that meant because she had lived it too. She realized that true royalty wasn't just inherited, it was earned. True endurance was measured by how one behaved when no one was watching. Anne chose duty not because it was glamorous, but precisely because it wasn't. Catherine embodied that principle perfectly. She faced public criticism with a grace that was almost unbearable. Despite early attacks on her background and harsh headlines during her pregnancy, she never fought back. She remained steady. Day after day, cause after cause, she earned trust by giving it rather than demanding it. Anne remembers watching her at an early Commonwealth banquet. Catherine said little that evening, but her eyes never strayed. She was fully present, truly listening. When an older politician made a thinly veiled jab about the current royals, Catherine merely smiled and nodded, poised and unshaken. That night, Anne stopped worrying whether Catherine might someday be queen. She realized Catherine already was. The rest of the world hadn't caught on yet. They were still caught up in titles, rituals, and pomp. They didn't understand that the most important coronation happens within the soul long before it takes place at Westminster. That's exactly what Anne saw when she circled that date. It wasn't just about the future king. It was about the woman standing beside him, the one who rose quietly without seeking attention, who proved herself worthy of the crown without ever needing to wear it. The woman who stood before the crown itself. That evening, Anne wrote a final note in the margin of her diary. This is not her ascension. It is her endorsement. Catherine didn't need a coronation to become queen, but the world did, and Anne was determined to make sure they saw what she had always seen. The meeting was held in a small drawing room, rarely used for formal events. There were no ceremonial chairs or grand paintings, just a round table, a silver tea set, and the three people who would quietly reshape the monarchy. Anne chose the room deliberately, not just for privacy, though it offered that, but because it was familiar and comfortable. It was the same parlor where Catherine had first met Queen Elizabeth, a meeting just as silent and significant. Another historic moment was about to unfold. William arrived first, his expression calm but unreadable. Charles had changed since making his decision. His movements were more purposeful, his eyes sharper. The weight of his choice hadn't crushed him. It had refined him. Anne noticed it the moment he entered. Catherine arrived seconds later, dressed simply, hair pulled back, without any press entourage. She greeted Anne with a warm, steady hug instead of a formal curtsy, a gesture of family, not protocol. Anne held her a moment longer than expected. Without any introduction, Anne placed her leather-bound notebook on the table and opened it to the page with the date circled twice in red. No speeches were spoken. No formal titles were mentioned. She slid the notebook toward them and said simply, "It's time." William studied the date silently for a long moment. Then he nodded, not out of duty, but with full understanding. "It's the right day," he said softly. Catherine reached for Anne's hand, not to ask for permission, but to offer something far stronger. "Collaboration. We'll do it right," she whispered. Anne believed her, always had. The quiet that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was sacred. A family, not a committee, acknowledged the moment history shifted, not with fanfare, but with heartfelt sincerity. Later that afternoon, Anne found Charles in his private study. He sat by the window, shoulders wrapped in a simple cardigan, a cup of tea untouched beside him. Outside, the rain fell steady and soft. He didn't turn when she entered. Instead, his voice floated like a thread through the glass. "Isn't it strange?" he said. "When everything stops pretending to be permanent." Anne didn't answer right away. She sat beside him and placed the notebook on the table, opened to the same page with the red circle. Charles didn't need to read it. He already knew. Still, he reached out, tracing the words with his fingertips as if touching a memory instead of a date. Looking at Anne, his voice dropped, raw and vulnerable. "Do you think it will be enough?" Anne could have answered with 1,000 words. She might have reminded him of his lifetime of service, the decades he'd spent preparing to lead, and the dignity with which he stepped aside. Instead, she stood, walked to the bookcase behind him, and touched one of their mother's favorite novels. Then she turned back. "It already is," she said. "Because it's your decision. Not history's. Not pressure's. Yours." Charles smiled softly, not with joy, but relief. And with that, the baton was not just passed, but truly accepted. Anne didn't write in her journal that night. She didn't need to. The moment had etched itself into the palace walls, filling the spaces between portraits, settling in the silence of generations longing for something new. One family meeting, one circled date, and quietly, a whole country began to change. The world didn't wake up to fireworks or breaking headlines, no announcements declaring the king's resignation or a new monarch's rise, no leaks, no moving trucks outside royal residences, no palace gossip. But the transition had begun. It was a silent moment, the kind Anne felt deep in her bones. Inside the palace, the change was subtle but real. When William entered a room, footmen paused just a moment longer. When Catherine passed by, courtiers straightened with a newfound respect. The weight of the future reign settled quietly in the corridors, like dust catching light only at certain angles. Anne observed it with her usual calm focus. She wasn't waiting for public approval. She was judging readiness, not from the institution, but from the people stepping into it. It wasn't just about the titles of king or queen consort. That was how the titles would be carried. And so far, Anne had witnessed something remarkable. Acceptance without arrogance, preparedness without fear. When the official announcement came weeks later, it landed softly, just as Anne had predicted. Buckingham Palace released a polished statement confirming what Anne had already recorded in her private sanctuary. William and Catherine's coronation was set for spring, when London's gardens would be in full bloom. The Globe called it unexpected news. But Anne knew this moment hadn't come suddenly. It had simply become clear. Curiosity and opinions exploded across newsrooms and social media. Analysts dissected every line of the press release, debating its tone. Critics questioned the timing, while supporters described it as modern, controlled, and elegant, dismissing the skeptics. Anne's attention, however, was elsewhere, on Catherine, seated alone in a quiet drawing room, holding a teacup untouched. The world would call her elegant. The palace would say she was prepared. But Anne sensed something deeper. She saw the weight behind Catherine's eyes, not fear, but understanding. The look of someone who knew her life had just been split into before and after, and that her name would never again be spoken without the echo of a crown. Anne approached quietly. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Instead, she took Catherine's hand firmly. Catherine repeated softly but firmly the promise she had made before. "We'll do it right." Anne gave a single nod, not an official blessing, but a confirmation. The days that followed rushed by. Rehearsals began. Speech drafts circulated. Cathedral staff gathered beneath vaulted ceilings, planning every procession with precise timing. Invitations were sent, titles assigned, and protocols double-checked. Yet Anne stood just outside it all, watching like someone who had already played her part. She was content, shaping things from the wings. She never sought the spotlight, nor needed it. Her role was always to safeguard the invisible thread connecting one monarch to the next, to ensure it held steady amid the pressures of modernity and spectacle. Now that the date was public, her duty was nearly done. That night, as London buzzed with anticipation, Anne returned to her desk. She didn't draft speeches or think about optics. Instead, she wrote a single sentence in the center of a blank page. "The crown will not be taken. It will be received." Then she closed her journal, not as an end, but as the beginning she had always expected. The unprecedented transition had already happened, and it sounded like trust. The crown didn't arrive with thunderous fanfare. It came quietly, with trust. While the world waited for trumpets and titles, golden robes and ancient vows, Anne had already stepped back, her work complete, her silence more powerful than any speech. She never stood in the spotlight. She observed from the sidelines, where she was always most effective, guiding change without demanding recognition. When William and Catherine face the world, all eyes will be on them. But tucked into the seams of Catherine's clothing is a brooch, not chosen by a stylist, but placed there by Anne. Queen Elizabeth had worn a simple gold pin on her first official tour as monarch, not for show, but for meaning. It communicated something Anne never had to say aloud. "You belong. The crowds will cheer. Headlines will soar. History will be captured in photographs and broadcasts. But Anne's legacy lives on in the unseen moments, the closed journal on her desk, the date circled in red, the steady hands working behind closed doors. This was never her coronation, yet she shaped it in every essential way. When the time came to pass the crown, Anne didn't raise her voice. She bowed her head and made sure it landed exactly where it was meant to, quietly, deliberately, and forever.